We'll start over. Okay. My name, first of all, is Pat Yambrilla. I'm secretary of the Boone County Historical Society. And I've been asked tonight to introduce our speaker. Our speaker I've known for many, many years. I worked with him here at the library for about 8.5 years. And I have retired from the library, and the speaker no longer works at our library. But because I had many years with him, I'm happy to introduce him to you tonight. James Duvall, I knew him as James, and his dad was a president of this society quite a few years ago. I can't remember when, Jim, that you were president.
Long ago.
Okay, all right. But our speaker, James Ken Duvall, I have, as I said, have known for many years, and he and his family live in Boone County. And his mom is of a family has been in this county since 1804. And I know his mom very well too. And James has a master's. He was, when I worked with him, he was assistant in the reference department, and predominantly with local history. Right, James? And you were responsible for starting what is now Chronicles of Boone County. That's on the Boone County website. You started that. And James has also written articles for some of the papers, like Northern Kentucky Heritage Magazine, and he wrote a booklet when this building was opened on Mary Ingalls, and it was sold here. I don't think they have any more copies to sell, as far as I know. And James also found amazing that he could read and knew Hebrew, the language Hebrew. I had trouble with Latin.
We know Boone County history is written in that language, so except for feeling Moses' stone.
Yeah, I had Latin in high school, don't remember anything. James knew Hebrew when I worked with him. As I said, I'm privileged to introduce him, and he's going to talk on Big Bone Springs Hotel. So let's give him a welcome.
She taught me a lot. She was interested. When I was just a kid, she was doing Boone County history, and I would go to the Florence Library, and she was doing the history then, and she kept the whole thing going for years when there wasn't a historical society. So she's the transition between the old historical society and the new historical society.
Steve wants to come up.
Yes, Steve's spent, well, when I talked to him 2 months ago, he had spent 30 hours on this PowerPoint, 33 hours and something. And I'm sure he spent more on it since then. So he probably knows it better than I do, because they asked me to do this, I think, back in October. It's been a while. And so I'm the kind of person that I like to say, can you do this tomorrow or maybe next week? If you give me 2 weeks or 2 months, I'm like, I don't know what I'll be doing then. So he knows this stuff. So I've asked him if he will give an overview of about 10 or 15 minutes of this material. I might say a word or two here and there, but he's going to give an overview, and then I'm going to kind of step in, and I'm going to try to put it into some kind of a historical perspective, not just a series of maybe so many facts or this or that date, but try to tie the whole thing together with the rest of our county history. All right? So,
well, forgive me for sitting down, but it makes it a little bit easier for me. Can everyone hear me okay?
I'm going to sit down too.
Very well. Okay, well, Jim put together this presentation, and I must admit, when I got into it, I was kind of overwhelmed with all the stuff that was on here. And what I've tried to do is I started putting together slides from the beginning of his presentation where he started. And at the beginning, we were looking at the early maps of Boone County in 1818 as it existed. And Jim, if you'll notice, point out those fine dotted lines. There's fine dotted lines shooting out from Burlington and going different ways. Those are the roads that existed in the very early days of Boone County. And you can see Florence wasn't even listed on there. but they had a dotted line that's going down that follows all the way to Walton, where it kind of picked up that ridge. But there was one from Burlington that comes all the way down through Big Boone, and then it continues on. And my understanding in the early days, that was a road that went on to Louisville at one time. And it crossed Mud Creek and continued close to the Ohio River as it was traveling that way. And it was different than going on what we know as US 42 today. So anyway, but in the early days, transportation to get to Big Bone was not easy. Roads were very difficult. It was one thing to build a road, but it was another one to maintain it. But the best way to get to Big Bone was through steamboats. And in the early 19th century, when the first riverboat came down the river, people were going, wow, what is that? And these were all going by. Well, not only that, in the early history, we find that a tavern was probably built around 1815, and John Wingate was also given a license in June of 1816. And then they consisted of a number of buildings, and the valley was heavily timbered at that time. And this is an interesting thing. The county set the rates for taverns, and these were the rates that were given for staying at the inn. And you can kind of see there was 1819 what the rates were, and then in 1830 they changed. Some of them was a little less than
37 and a half and 25. It went down to 25 cents.
So 50 cents would have gone a long ways in those days at a tavern. We don't have a whole lot of idea as to how the tavern was run, but similar taverns that were run at that time. There was one done by this Thomas Henderson, and he had a 6-room structure, and he had slaves. And it was an interesting thing. I noticed, if you'll notice one of the bullet points, it says he had slaves that served the tables, that waited on the tables, but they were required to whistle while they were carrying the food so they wouldn't sample the food. And this was a later picture of Thomas Henderson's building, although this was not at Big Bone, but it was a similar one of that time frame. And then this was a gentleman named Constantine Raffines. Yeah, and he was a Frenchman. He talked about his time when he came. He surveyed the area for Indian mounds, and he was talking about the water at the lake contained salt and sulfur, and it had a bluish cast. And he was talking about the springs and the water at that time. He said the hunting was for small game and bison, but the bison were long gone. We think they were gone by, what, 1815, I believe?
Yeah, somewhere between 1815 and 1820. So
Yeah.
It came in 1821,
Right.
so there may have been one or two left.
And then, so that was some of the early days. Then we were talking about the steamboats on the Ohio River, and there were a lot of steamboats that were built, and actually some of them, I was surprised when I was reading his article, some were actually built there at Big Bone. I think 3 different
We
boats.
have a record of 5.
Record of 5 boats.
But
But they ran out of a certain kind of wood that they couldn't build anymore, and they stopped building.
When the white oak ran out, that was the end of the industry.
But needless to say, many boats ran into accidents on the river in those early days. And there's one account here where Richard Johnson asked Henry Clay about his experience on the steamboat, and he traveled to New Orleans on one boat and came back on another, in which it broke the beam, and they had to repair it before they got back. So, needless to say, traveling on in the steamboats was a bit of a problem in those days. The earliest boats looked about like this. The first boats that were on the river. Later, they got a lot more fancy. They looked more like this boat on the river. And then there was a historian, Dr. Willard Joseph.
He's from Boone County.
Yeah,
Born in Boone County.
He was an early historian and geologist. He was a state geologist in Kentucky, and Dr. Gilson talked about the lick and the number of families that would come. He said in that beautiful valley came the families of the Breckenridges, the Todds, the Crittens, the Clays, and the McDonalds, and many others from over the Commonwealth of Kentucky. So apparently it was a resort that a lot of people wanted to go to. Keep in mind, this was before the days of Kentucky State Parks. Most of the land at the spring was then owned by Mr. Carnell, and he had surveyed the lands, and then there was, we have a map of some of the early ones. Now I've got 2 or 3 maps. This is a Cooper map from 1831, and it shows an overall thing. If you look at the very bottom, you'll see that's the Ohio River, so you're looking inland from what's Hamilton's Landing back to where Big Boone is located. And I'm going to get another map that gets a little bit closer. This is, now the river is over on the left side.
We turned it on its side because we...
And showing where the end was located. It was like a U shape here, and showing where the springs were. The springs were to the right.
This is the Gum Spring, and then there were other little springs different. Here's several, the Lick Springs, and then down at Mud Lake on down the river, that was even bigger. The White Sulphur Spring was down
And
there.
then this was a closer view of the close-up view of that same map, from the Cooper map from 1831. Okay. The expansion of the hotel went on in 1831, and it was the importance of the river traffic. And with the river was only 2 miles away, people would often, get off the boats and come to the landing because roads were really difficult in those days. It was one thing to get a road constructed, but it was another thing to maintain it. And going down to Big Bone, I can remember as a kid in the 1830s, the road going down to Big Bone was, well, it was windy, and it wasn't until the state put a park in that the road became a whole lot better. And but anyway, in 1835, the town of the Landing was established by the legislature, and the post office, although it was started at Big Bone Lick, they soon moved it to the Landing 2 miles away. And then this was a statement that was made by an Englishman that had come to visit, and he was remarking about the staying at a tavern in those days. And he said, Americans think nothing of sleeping 4 or 5 in on a bed. And I thought it was interesting. Look at the bottom statement about the Frenchman traveling in Kentucky. He, about 1860, noted the tendency to sleep as many as possible in one bed. Americans travel hardly ever talk to each other, but they make no objection to sleeping in the same bed. And that was interesting. One of the, this one gentleman, Godfrey Vaughn, said that when he requested a single bed, the innkeeper thought he was ill and asked if he wanted to retire early. Anyway, this gentleman had visited Kentucky, and he made a comment about the massive forests that were so magnificent in size, and the variety of trees was unlike he had ever seen before. The whole area at that time must have been extremely heavily forested, and all virgin forest, and it must have been a remarkable time. Later on, there was a commissioner's sale, and they sold the land, and then the hotel closed around 1847, and it burnt down soon after. And then it went for a period from 1857, the new railroad was built, and they wanted to start a new hotel. And during the Civil War, when John Hunt Morgan and Captain Hines escaped from Yankee prison, they went past through Big Bone Lake, but there was nothing there. There were no hotels at all. In 1864, though, there was getting close to the end of the war, and the Springs was involved in legal transactions, and the land was transferred to a John G. Carlisle and McLaughlin, and they rented out the premises. And then soon after the Democrat reported in 1870 that there was a barbecue at Big Bone. It was well attended. Around 1872, a charter was granted for the Independence Big Bone Turnpike the following year. Stagecoach lines ran between Walton, Burlington, Covington, and Georgetown. Things were getting more prosperous. By 1871, McLaughlin decided to go into the hotel business in earnest, and he began to build a new structure. He completed it in 1873. The new hotel was not built at the same spot where the old structure was.
And that's the one you saw on the initial
Right.
picture that was up there.
And the building itself, from all reports, was a two-story structure, long veranda. The left end toward the river, it was an entrance consisting of double doors to the ballroom, and the ballroom itself was elaborately plastered with chandeliers. And I think I read something else, that there were a number of cabins around this hotel, and they had rooms for probably 50 different rooms. Is that what you had?
To verify, I don't know so much about that hotel. The person that's written the most about it that I'm aware of is Miss Roeder in White Kittens and Four-Leaf Clovers. She has a chapter in her book about this hotel, which she saw when she was a little girl. So nobody else even remembers it that I know or hear of. So what she writes in there is all the information that I know about it. But that's the third hotel, basically, because the second one, we have three basic hotels. So
Okay. Well, anyway, McLaughlin put this ad about this appeared in the Covington Daily Commonwealth in July 27th of 1881, advertising about coming to the Sulphur Springs. And
that's the one, yes.
That's the picture we have of the hotel.
That's the third one. We don't know what the other one looked like, but we know what that one.
And we're not sure what this is. I
might be a
think it
bathhouse.
might have been, that we don't know if it was the springs where people took mineral baths or just exactly what.
Maybe a bathhouse or a party
Uh,
house.
In 1877, the establishment of the springs was visited by Albert Berry, mayor of Newport, and he said one of the pleasantest places to visit in this hot weather is the Big Bone Springs. Colonel Campbell and his son, formerly of Burlington, have charge of the Clay House there, and now it's the very best to provide comfort and amusement to their guests. Apparently there was a lot of people that came to visit. Here's a picture that Jim had that I put up of people standing around the
I might
springs
mention
in
one thing. The Clay
1880.
Hotel was named for Henry Clay, Kentucky's favorite son. So it was named for Henry Clay in her period. This is 1880, and notice here the water is still gushing up out of the ground. If you go there now, it's just kind of just trickling. And there was a time, John Drury Lloyd said, when it gushed higher than that. And so it depended on how big the trees were, and as they cut the trees, the water level went down. But you can still see it's up, it's still enough to gush up through this stump. So that's interesting.
This was the map of the 1883 Atlas, and you
This is
can
Hamilton's Landing. This is the Indian Hill. A hotel was right here. This is Big Bone area. This is where the park is now. And the Mudvig Springs was down here. And this is the White Sulphur Spring mentioned on here. All these maps are in my books up here. If anybody wants to look through some of that and see some of the articles and research that are available. But there's a book of maps there. And if you want to look at it more closely, you can.
Well, later, there were a number of doctors, Dr. Stevenson and several other doctors that set up shop down there and invited people to come and for the springs to bathe in it, to drink it, and it was there were a lot of doctors that were involved with that. They set up shop and had.
This picture, by the way, was given to me by his great-grandson. He came in the library one day trying to find out something for him, and I was able to find information that he didn't know. And he said, well, I'm going to give you a copy of this picture. So this was his great-great-great-grandfather, and Johnny Stevenson was my great-great-great-uncle. So they worked together. So we had kind of he was a Wood, and I was a Duvall. I wasn't a Stevenson. But it was kind of an interesting thing that we were able to exchange information there. So he gave me that picture. I don't have one, Dr. Stevenson, but I do have that one. So continue, please.
Okay, and in 1896, the conditions of the hotel were reported as very poor, and part of it was due to the poor roads. There was later attempts to capitalize on the spring, but none of them were very successful. Until natural gas was found in the area, it appears that the sulfur water was the primary product for Big Boone. Then the Big Boone Springs Water Company started in business, and they were buying and selling and bottling water, dealing with the spring waters and other waters. There was some success in selling the springs, but it was short-lived, and it was only by becoming a state park that the area improved. I wanted to jump ahead to this one. This was an ad that appeared in the...
This is for the water, the advertisement for the water.
And that was from Maysville, Kentucky.
Yes, this was from the Maysville paper, it says here. And so I found that in the Maysville paper, and I thought that was interesting. We don't have anything like that in Boone County Recorder, but that's what they were selling in Maysville. They were selling our water down there. So there was other places as well that they were selling it. This is about 1916 or so.
And this picture here that I skipped was the toll roads in Boone County around 1916. And it shows the roads that existed, the toll roads.
That's in Paul Tanner's book that Pat's selling back there if you want to know more about that. She'll let you have one for a quarter, or they go up to $1 now. Whatever. This makes them worth more. So, okay, now this is our thing, and so I think I'll start here with this map here, and then later, if you want to. Okay,
Why don't you
she's going to time me down. But if you'll stay there, because if you'll find my stuff, I'm terrible at finding things on the computer. I'm terrible at. I get nervous and I start pushing stuff, and then everything goes haywire. So I don't know if any of you ever had that trouble. But this is southern Boone County from Big Bone Island. Big Bone Island is no longer there. There was a big flood, ice flows, and they let every water out down at the dam, and it just sheared off Big Bone Island. I've been over it in a canoe. You can put your paddle down. It's there, but it's laid down. But if you start from Big Bone Island and look back this way, you can see how it looks. Let me lay this down just a minute. I'll show you here. So we are here. Okay, so this is Hamilton. I actually live right here. And so if you come down here, and I live right here, and this is where Big Bone Island is, right here. And you come up here, here's Big Bone. It's about 3.5 miles or so to Big Bone. And Mud Lick is right down here. And so Mud Lick Creek runs in here. The south fork of the Big Bone comes here, and that's Gallatin County. And then the Big Bone Creek runs here and runs all the way up into Dark Hollow and some of the other ones. And Gum Branch comes down here and runs into it this way.
Let me pull up a slide that might show that a little bit.
Okay.
Look at this one.
Yeah, this one is a little bit clearer. You can see now with the water level, when the dam went in, it changed everything, the way everything looks. And so it raised the water level, and this embayment that you see here, right here, would have not been underwater at one time. And so the island would be down here, and it changed depending on where you were. If you take the maps, starting with Zadok Kramer's in like 1805, and you look at all the maps which I've collected, they're in there, and it keeps moving. Sometimes it's two islands, sometimes it's over on the Indiana side, sometimes it's up here, sometimes it moves down further, where Gallatin County is. So it doesn't stay in the same place. It's like one of those sandbars, kind of thing. It just keeps moving. But it was a substantial island. I think it was about 12 acres there, and somebody farmed it. And Bruce Ferguson and them staged a battle there, and even had airplanes that flew over and dropped bags of flour. That's something we'll look at sometime maybe. But there's a lot of things with that. But if you look, you can see back through there. Now that was their way of looking at it, because most of the things started from the river. Now I found this in the Campbell County Court Orders, and it tells you what the problems were with the roads and why Big Bone didn't develop any more than it did, or as slow as it did. Campbell County Court Orders, Book A, 180, 8th of October, 1798. That's less than a year before we become a county. We became a county in July of 1899. 1799. I get my centuries mixed up. 1799. So this is less than a year. So, beginning at Bulletsburg, then through the lands of Cave Johnson to Sandy Lick Creek, through the lands of John Brown and Cave Johnson, passing to said Johnson's Mill. Thence up the right-hand fork of the creek, hence turning left, passing through the lands of Thomas Whitaker, Samuel Horsley, and William Montague. Thence crossing the branches of Wolper Creek, and passing through unsettled lands to Gunpowder Crossing just above the forks, thence taking a buffalo road, which runs up a branch of Gunpowder and onto a dividing ridge, continuing along said road to the lick. Now, if somebody is standing in Bullensburg, which is close to Petersburg, if they said, how do you get to Big Bone, and they gave you that kind of directions, how long do you think it would take you to get there? Okay? Like, there's one road I laugh, and it says, it runs such and such and thence through the briar patch. And it was like, that sounds like, you know, it running through the briar patch. And so that's about the way it was. I mean, these were dug out of the mud, and you know how some of this mud is around here. And the hills are worse, it washes down, but then the low places never dry out. And so they're digging down into the mud. They make a road. By law, they're supposed to be like 30 feet wide, but at a minimum 15 feet wide. And every time a tree falls, every time this, every time that. I read a road order from up, and this was from up in Indiana. It was like, any tree stump higher than a carriage axle has to be dug out of the road. Well, they had tree stumps this high, the axles could just go over, and that was even at a later period. So the roads were terrible. The roads were really the one inhibiting factor for the economy, for movement of ideas. People, you know, well, let's go visit Aunt Sally. Well, it's going to take, you know, whatever. And this is in the days before the toll roads. And there was what they called in France the corvée system. Everybody had to work on the road. Unless you were really old, you were exempt because of old age and infirmity. A few of us might do that, but most people had to work on the roads. And so they go out, and you had to spend a certain amount of time working on the roads by law, by state law. If you didn't, you went to jail. And so it wasn't a very good system, because everybody wanted to work on a road close to their home. Everybody wanted their road to be better, and everything, probably a third of the orders in the court order book are relating to roads. First, they have to decide where the road's going to run. So they send somebody out like this one to say a report of a road. Okay, you'll go this way. Okay. Then somebody's got to come back, and if anybody objects, I don't want the road to run through mine. Then they have to have a thing. They have to send out a jury, and they have to decide if there's any loss to the owner. So it's a complicated thing. They didn't just go run a road. Everybody's like, oh, they just ran a road. No. Then they had to come back, and if the owners did, they either had to compensate them, or, you know, they just nixed that road. They said, we won't do that one. But then they did it. Then they had to cut it out. Now, cut it out is literally cut it out. And you do it with an axe and a shovel. You go cut down trees. You go dig up some. There's no gravel, almost any. Now, there's gravel down in those pits, but there's not gravel up on the hills where anybody wanted it. And so you had to literally cut the road out. And guess what? When you cut the road out, guess what you found? Mud. Okay? As long as it was dry, it wasn't too bad. It was dusty, but you can travel in the dust pretty much. But when it gets muddy, you can't. Okay? There was one carriage in 1810, and even as late as 1815. In 1810, there was one carriage in the whole county. And I think in 1815, I looked it up somewhere, it's like one carriage and 2 wagons. Okay? There was not that many wheels. There was like 9 wheels in the whole county. One of them was like a 3-wheel thing. And so nobody had wheels. Why? Because wheels went down in the mud, and they stayed there too. And so everybody walked or else rode a horse. If you were a little bit better off, you rode a horse. You get there a little bit faster. And so if you walked, you know, you can walk, you know, a long way. But the county couldn't be too big, because if you were going to get to Burlington, you wanted to get there that day, like for the next day. So they didn't want any courthouse to be more than a day's walk away for anybody in the county. So that's why we have 120 counties, 120 pretty small counties, okay, by and large. So by the time you get all these roads going, so the roads were the big thing. So one reason Big Bone did as well as it did early was because of the river, the connection in the river. Now what's the difference? Well, Christopher Graham started Graham Springs in Harrodsburg, and there's no river there, there's no water there, but he, on his own, with his own money, paid men to come and build a paved road from Lexington to Harrodsburg. And guess what? All the fine people and their carriages went to Graham Springs, and Graham Springs prospered because he had paved the road there. There wasn't any of this getting stuck in the mud. They never could do that at Big Bone. Even as late as 1816, Myrex Crouch was saying, we need to build a traction road to Big Bone. He was the banker. He was Dr. Myrex Crouch. He could make things happen. He was on the school board, and he had political blood. He never could get it done. And so Big Bone, after a while, after about the 1845, 1850, and then with John O'Campbell, there was kind of a renaissance. But the big thing was always getting there. And if the road was okay, you know, some of the summer months it was good. If the road was rainy, everybody was mud up to here. If carriages. By the time Mr. Hogan was talking about was running his carriage, the roads were better. They still weren't very good. Even in the 1900s, they really weren't very good. If you look in the Boone County Recorder, so many articles, almost every letter to the paper, the roads are so bad, the roads. And I don't mean to just keep talking about the roads when we're talking about Big Bone, but the problem was getting there. So the steamboat, when it came along, was a big thing. 1811, Roosevelt built a steamboat, not Theodore, but his cousin, and Nicholas Roosevelt. And he built the first viable steamboat, and he himself and his wife came down the steamboat in 1811, and unusually, we have a record of that. It was written in the Covington papers. I think it was Chambers, or R.W. Chambers, but anyway, he wrote a letter in which he said that we were out in the field working, us and our slaves, and they all worked together, and so he said, we saw this thing coming down the river, and it was like fire coming out the top of it. And somebody said, what is that? They did that, and someone said, I think it's a floating sawmill. And so they really didn't know what it was, so they went down the river. They had some complications too, going down the river, but that was the first one, 1811, so that marks it. Now there weren't a whole lot right after that, but then in a few years they start building in Cincinnati. We had the 5 in Cincinnati that he talked about. Then the white oak timber ran out. That's when you run out of that. And so, so that was the way to go. And so that's really what made the springs. That's why I came there. Of course, there was the attraction of the bones. People had heard about them, but they didn't, they would come see the bones, but what they wanted was that mineral water. Dr. Daniel Drake, who was a famous physician in this area at the time, he started that big cathedral downtown Cincinnati. He was one of the elders of it and the first members. They got a big plaque to him there. I would go in there. Sometimes I would see his plaque. But he wrote a lot of stuff. He was really a promoter of the area, and he said that the minerals at Big Bone Lick have almost a perfect constitution of minerals for certain types of diseases. In different places they were different, but they had analyzed them. But he said for the different diseases, and all there was, asthma and bronchitis and all that different kinds of stuff, and that Big Bone was really one of the most ideal mixtures that you could get. And so there was some other, there was like French Lick in Indiana, and I talked about Grand Springs, and then there was Drennan's Lick and whatever. There was different places throughout the state, and some of them got to be pretty well known. But Big Bone kind of had the name at that time, but it was still hard to get to. If you didn't have enough money to take a steamboat trip, you were going to have trouble getting here. So it did tend to draw some of the richer people. Now when Constantine Raphanis, who was a Frenchman, but he was born in Constantinople, so he spoke all these different languages. He was well-versed. He was probably our premier scientist. He was at Transylvania University, and he came throughout the state, and he cataloged fish. He wrote a book on the fish of the Ohio River, and describes the whole entire Ohio River, every creek and everything that runs into it. But he came here in 1821. Now, the article he published was in 1831. And the map, if you want to put that map up there, that's the map that was published with the article. And he said this map was drawn by Mr. Cooper, and he said it is tolerably accurate. What does that mean? It's not accurate, but it's close enough for, one old guy told me not to park, close enough for government work. So it was, it's pretty close. Now, there's some interesting features there. Turn to the next one, because, and I don't know, I might have to have you talk for me while I do this. You might repeat what I say. This map is very interesting. Now, when he says tolerably accurate, that means probably that to scale. I mean, Constantine was a scientist, so he would have probably analyzed a little bit different. But this is pretty much what was there. Here's the Ohio River, where we're used to seeing it. And here's the ridge, it says along with the river. And this is the big Indian Hill. And Jefferson tells in one of his letters how the Indians said that the last mammoth or mastodon had jumped from here over the Wabash River. So that was a pretty long jump. And so then there's hills here. And then this is where the hotel was. This is the road that went from the lick down to Hamilton's Landing. Later on, Joel Hamilton lived here, so it's called Hamilton's Landing. He actually planted the town. So it was about a little over 2 miles there. And then you can see this is more like just a path. It says that the road goes on this way, and this is probably, it's hard to say, it's a little bit confused here. But notice there's an island here. That island is not there now. And probably, remember, the water was much lower than it is because the river was down. And so the water flowed out more freely and fast probably than it did then. and there was a lot more marsh. John Uri Lloyd said when he first saw it that there was 50 acres of marsh. Zadok Kramer says there's acres and acres and acres of marsh, he said, full of dead stumps and a buzzard sitting on every stump. So, you know, it was the kind of place where you go and you were like, this is really weird, but I don't really know exactly what I'm seeing. So, I can't move around as much as I like with this. It got me on a short leash. So, but anyway, this map, if you study it, and it's, I think it's online. I think we have it online. The paper that I wrote for this, he said, are you going to give your PowerPoint along with this? And I was like, this paper's never been delivered before. Nobody's ever heard this before. So this is all fresh stuff. So, but then, anyway, there's a map of that in there, and that should be put on the Historical Society website before very long. And so it'll do that. But if you want to study that map real closely, there's some very interesting things there, and it has changed considerably. John Uri Lloyd, who I delivered it's been about at least 10 years ago, I delivered a paper on him for this society. And but John Uri Lloyd and his father-in-law, Thomas Rouse, decided they were going to see how deep the mud in the lick was. So they took these big long rods, they weren't bamboo, but they were some kind of big long wooden rods, and so they started connecting them and pushing them down in the mud. And he said, we got 16 of them down in the mud and we never did reach the bottom. So, you know, he was experimenting with it. John Uri Lloyd was one of the things, he started the Big Bum Lick Historical Association, and he was one of the ones that was really one of the things that led to the founding of the park. And Willard Rouse Gilson's book mentions him in there, and so on like that. So, is there anything else you feel like I need to cover? Is there anything I haven't talked about enough? Okay. I could talk about this. You can see how much stuff there's 10 volumes of stuff there, and there's plenty. I could probably give 25 lectures on this, different aspects of this, because there is so much stuff. All the stuff about the bones and Jefferson's interest in it. And when Lewis and Clark came, I delivered a paper on Christopher Columbus Graham. I wrote a paper for the Journal of the JKAS, Journal of the Kentucky Academy of Science. Remember when I wrote that one, Pat? And Dr. Thuray at Northern, he asked me to do that one. So, you know, I've got a lot of different aspects of this, some of it I've published, and I've got a lot of things. So we could talk about this for a long time and never really run out of information. And when you start talking about, especially in relation to the whole county history and even national interest here, you could say a lot. So what I would really like to do, how much time do we have left?
Oh, another 5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes. In that 5 to 10 minutes, if somebody would like to ask a few questions, we might be able to answer. Or if somebody has a statement, something they would like to make, something that they knew, and if you'd like to ask a question, you can do so. Yes, ma'am.
I always like to know where, like, this hotel was relative to what we see today. So that map there where the hotel is.
Yes. Let me put you go down past the park. That's Beaver Road, right? Everybody with me?
Yeah.
You go past the old Methodist Church, right? You keep going, you go there, and there's Gum Branch Road. That's the old Cherry's Wagon Road back in 1805. They keep talking about that in the court orders. And so as you go past there, you go, and there is Boat Dock Road. All right, you know where the old trailer park was? Beaver keeps going, Boat Dock turns off. It was right there in that area, right where the old trailer park was. In fact, when they dug up the septic tank from that, it was a huge, great big thing. They dug it up with a big thing, and that about is where that was sitting, somewhere in there.
Does it take you past the Indian burial mound?
Well, this is Indian Hill over here, and it's right here. You can see from that. Let me put this down.
Want the closer one? Want the closer map?
Yeah, get the closest map we can. Well, no, maybe not, because
Okay, let me back it up.
yeah. Now this here is Beaver Road, about Beaver Road. Now the way they've got this, it probably is more like this, okay? And then here's the Gum Springs. The Gum Springs, now, he's probably right when he says tolerably accurate, because he's not quite that. This is the Gum Spring, okay? The Gum Spring is like, if you're standing in the Gum Spring, which is almost dry now, I know because I was there, 2 girls had a wreck down in there, and I went down there to try to get them out, and whatever, they were okay. But the church is like there. You could throw a little pebble and hit it from there. So it's like right here, okay? The road now like runs right past here. The creek doesn't run across the road, so it should probably be down here. Right here, and when you come here, this, we'll put it up here, this is the continuation of Beaver Road, okay? This is Boat Dock Road, and basically, though this is not here, this road runs to Burlington. This is the old Cherry Wagon Road, okay? That runs through the unsettled lands, remember that we were talking about? This road continues on, okay? This, as Jack Rouse once pointed out to me, is the new road. This one that we see there now, Boat Dock Road, most of it. He said the old road runs down right past the park, and then it turns off where it's Bender Road. Is anybody familiar with Bender Road? I guess it was named for old Grandma Bender. I saw a picture of her once. She was a little old German lady about this big. And she hadn't lived in Boone County for a long, long time, but she got the road named after her. But that was the old road to Louisville, and it goes down, and it runs out now. I used to deliver water down there for traps. We'd go down there, and it would run out. It would run down in the creek. But you can see where it used to go. And it went all the way down. It went past Warsaw. It went all the way down. It went all the way to Louisville, originally. And so, if you go to where the bridge is there, there's the Methodist Church, then there's the bridge, and then it turns off the Boat Dock Road. It's right in this area here, somewhere. And we can see the shape of it by the way it's outlined on this map. But I wanted to take this map, I didn't have time to do it, and lay it over the GIS and the 1883 atlases and try to, as the GIS people say, rubber sheet it, you know, kind of squeeze it, everything around and make it fit. And I didn't really have time to do that, and I don't really have quite the skills to do that. It takes somebody that's, you know, a good digital person, you know, knows how to do that stuff to really make it work. So I didn't have time to do that. So that's just kind of, we'll call it a schematic. It's just kind of give us an idea. We know there was an island there then. See, that was probably, Cooper was probably drawing on what Raffinese said. He's probably drawing it in 1831, but he's basically drawing what Raffinese saw in 1821. So it's really 10 years earlier than that. So in 1821, we know there was an island there. Or Raffinese would have said, oh, I wasn't an island there when I was there, you know. And so you know that. And so some of the different things that are named here, we know were there. We just can't be quite sure. See, like this says Salt Spring, Old Salt Wells, excavations in search of bones, Gum Springs, at which big bones were found, and the Old Fort. Now the Old Fort, I know nothing about. It's not listed in Butler's history. It's not listed in Marshall's history. It's not listed. There's one listed at Walton. There's one listed in some other places. But where the Old Fort was, if it was on the island maybe, I don't know. If anybody wants to go help look for it, we can do some excavations, you know. But we don't know. We just simply don't know. We've given a hint. You know, it's like, hey, that sounds interesting. We don't know. I heard a guy, he was a little younger than me. Oh, we used to come down here. There was an old fort. And I was like, I'm older than you, and I used to come down here. There wasn't any old forts. So, you know, sometimes people, you know, old forts move around and stuff like that. But anyway, I don't know where that old fort would have been. I mean, he's got, I don't know where in excavations and now. I don't know if any part of it can be found now. It would be an interesting topic for a historical society meeting. That was a good question. Anybody else? Did I answer that? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
You know about what was that picture taken of those girls by the spring there?
Yeah, that should have been up in the main spring. Now, if you go up where the museum is, okay, and then you walk down that path, they got that where the big bones are, but that's not the main spring. They got these big, as they used to say, I worked there, and so the guys that worked there, down there where them plastic elephants are, they say, so okay, the plastic animals, okay. So you walk down past there, and then you go down, and there's another one that's boxed in, it's close to the creek. And it still sometimes gets up. You can see salt water on it. It still smells sulfury. And you can see sometimes, and you can see a sheen on the creek where it runs down. But it's just a real slope. That was where it was. And apparently at that time it did shoot up. And what John Uri Lloyd said is when they cut down those trees, and he gave a list. If you look in Warwick of the Knobs, and especially in Felix Moses, he tells about some of those trees. And he said they were huge. 36 men could stand in them, you know, and sometimes, you know, people like 16 men could stand across in the hollow of one of those trees. And so he said when those trees were cut down or fell down, some of them through old age, the roots were enormous. There's one when you go down to Gum Springs Road, there's a tree. I wanted to get a picture of this, but I didn't have my camera. But there's a root, and there's a tree about the road, and you can see where the cut is, where you're down here, and it's up here, and the roots of that tree come out, and they fork. I mean, it's just a huge, big thing. And so those trees develop these big, that holds a lot of water. And so the water moved really slowly. Instead of coming down and running off the surface like it does now, it would percolate down there. The trees would drink up all this water and whatever. And so it just kind of moved slowly and seeped through all that kind of stuff. And there was, it was marshy. It was, they called it, some of them called it jelly ground, some of them called it, whatever, and it said you couldn't walk on it, you'd lose your cow out there in it. And so, when the mastodons and stuff came, they'd fall in that.
Remember any bottles of the Big Bone Salt Springs water found? Or
I haven't seen them. There was a black lady, and her parents lived up on what's Beaver Road, past where Beaver Lick is. And she said, my parents came down here and got water at the lick and bottles and brought it home. We drank that for breakfast every morning, whether we wanted to or not. And they didn't really want to. That's why they were so healthy, I guess. But there was other people I've heard say, we drank this water regularly. Our parents went and got it, or we got it in bottles and brought it home. And that was even before the sales of this stuff, or even after the sales of this stuff. And it really wasn't very smelling water, good smelling water. It really wasn't something you take. It's something you take, like castor oil. We do this because it's good for us, not because we think it tastes good. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, I've got an old antique bottle from French Lick.
Okay, that would be
It's printed. I just wondered.
One of the things I mentioned French Lick, the best way to understand this, everybody's like, well, I want to know everything about this, and you can collect stuff. But if you'll go through, I have articles about French Lick and some of the other ones, and by looking at some of the other places, you can tell what they are doing in this place. For instance, we have the ferries across here. Well, I found a book. It was like When Horses Walked on Water was the name of it, and it was about horse-powered ferries. Well, we had some, but we don't have them anymore. We don't know anything. But this guy had excavated one up in Michigan, and he had found it. So he talked about all the horse-powered ferries. He mentioned some in Kentucky and whatever. And if you read a book like that, it's talking about all the ferries, but it tells you a lot more about your own, because they all did pretty much the same thing. So if you get too myopic and just look at your little area, you don't get very much. If you open up and say, I'm focusing here, but I'm including anything that will help, then you bring in all this other stuff, and then you start getting information. Now, we know how people felt about it. We know how people traveled here, how people did that, why this one was doing good and that one was doing bad. For instance, the salt at Big Bone Lick. Big Bone Lick was salt-making place. Mary Ingalls came here and boiled salt. Everybody was boiling salt. Coquitlam was boiling salt until 1805, and then they found the canal salt works. Well, they had such saltier salt there that they could sell it a lot cheaper because they didn't have to boil it nearly as much. And so Big Bone quit. Goose Lick down in Manchester, Kentucky, they had a big salt boiling thing down there. It disappeared about the same time. It couldn't compete economically. And so a lot of times, if you just look at, well, I don't know why the salt boilers went away, but they do talk about in the records, local people still boil salt here sometimes, because they didn't have the money necessarily to buy the expensive salt from other places. Then, of course, the ones in Kanawha went out when they found all the salt mines up in Michigan, and they're digging pure salt out of the ground, like rock salt out of the ground. So it just depends on where you are in the period as to what's economically viable. So if you look all over, you can tell what's going on. If you just look in one place, it's kind of a mystery. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
The Charles Lyell geologist, is that the same Charles Lyell from Europe? That
Yes, from England. Yes, he wrote two geology. He was a famous geologist.
And he influenced Darwin's evolution.
Yes, he wasn't exactly a Darwinist. It was more like
the evolution of the Earth's crust.
Yeah, but he was famous for that. But he had a very mild version of Darwinism. He dealt mostly with geology,
right,
and not with any kind of evolutionary stuff. But he traveled all over, Patagonia, all that kind of stuff. But he was very interested in traveling to Big Bone. And when he said when he came from Cincinnati, he came down. It must have been what's now 42, but probably not quite there. However the trails ran. But anyway, he said it was like this thick cover. It was like covering the road. And he said that almost nowhere on earth will you see this kind of hardwood forest covering you as you travel. I wish I could read the passage because there's a big long paragraph in his book. I think the second edition of it. And I think Miss Fitzgerald had both editions, so I read them in both. And the second one, he kind of beefed it up a little bit. But he was talking about this forest, and it was like, this is the way it was. And people don't realize that it was forest all the way to the river. Even the riverbanks, it would hang over the Ohio River. There was none of these bare banks that you see now. And they said that a squirrel could start on the East Coast, say Boston or Philadelphia or someplace, and run all the way from treetop to treetop to tree, limb to limb, all the way to the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
That's what they said. Now, I'm sure there were some bare places, like a tree would fall and then stuff would grow, whatever. If it hadn't been for that. But they said it was so tree. And I have in one of those things, I had some research that shows how much of the U.S., eastern U.S., particularly because the West was a little bit different, how much of it was forested. It was like 99%, 98%. And then they said in 1810, and it was like a lot, 1840, and by the time you get to like 1930, it's like the dots get very, very far apart, and they're even further apart now. Now, Kentucky still has a lot of trees, but it's all second, third, and maybe fourth growth timber. We don't have much virgin timber. We have a few places. Mark Jacobs tells me we have a few places. When I was on conservation, he would tell me stuff like that. He said, we still have a few down there in, across from Dinsmore House, down in that woods. What do they call that down there?
Middle Creek.
Yeah, he said he still thinks there's a few areas that's virgin timber. And then we have Lilywood and Lily Cornet Woods, and we have a few other places that are still virgin timber, basically. And there was an Englishman that came to Cincinnati, and he read in his book, he was like, you all are cutting down all this timber. He said, there's going to come a day when you are so sorry you did this. And I think that day's about come, because there was a time like Cincinnati, you could just, it was timber, the tree banks, you know, and the whole river banks and everything was just covered with timber. Now maybe we didn't need quite that much, but it's a shame we couldn't have preserved a little bit more of it than we did. But anyway, any other questions? Are we about done now? And we don't want to go longer than you all do, but if anybody's got a question, we'd like to try to answer.
About the Methodist church there.
What about it?
Well, what's the age of it?
It was built in 1888. We assume there were more Methodists there, you know, earlier than that. The Methodists were not super big in this county. There were other places that there were. Now, down at Pike's Landing, there's the East Bend Baptist and the East Bend Methodist. There's nobody there at the Methodist church anymore. But Gail Stewart, who was the barber at Union, was the pastor of both of those churches for quite a long time.
Right.
And so they got down at Big Bone, they had 5 members, and I don't know how many he had at Pike's Landing. I think he had less. And so when they got down to 5 members, they more or less quit. Bertha Black told me she was one of them, and Joe Hamilton was one of them, and there's 2 or 3 others. I guess her husband and Charlie, and then whatever. Anyway, it was down to 5 members. And so there weren't very many, but they had started in 1888. There's a picture of them with the whole congregation out front. So the Big Bone Baptist Church is quite a bit earlier. It started in 1843, and that's when their building was built. And so, or just maybe the year after. I think it was built in that year. So it's not only older, but it's still there. It's still going strong. The old building's gone now.
Yep.
The old style block's still out in front, but the building's gone. But those were the 2 major churches there. There was a Mud Lick Baptist Church that was down closer on the other side of the creek, down closer to Mud Lick. I'm not sure exactly where it was, but and there was also one at Beaver Lake. So, is there anybody else with a question? Okay, I'm going to call that done. Okay, so it's been a pleasure to talk to you. I hope all of you present the material in a little bit more orderly fashion, and then we can kind of discuss it, because it's not just getting a certain number of facts from my head into your head or off the screen into your head, because the facts are important. You can always look those up. It's better to understand how they relate to other things, how they relate to the county history, how they relate to the history of the roads and what people thought. And there's so many things that I wish I could have told you. You know, when I rehearsed this to myself a month or so ago, I did it, and it was like, well, this is going to turn out good. And I feel like it didn't turn out so good because I missed a lot of things that when you're thinking to yourself, you do all right. But there are a lot of connections, and so if you do that, I'm going to put the paper, make it available for them to put online. If you want to read through that, you may be able to pick up a few things that we missed tonight. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you.